Hello everybody, welcome to visit Korea YouTube channel Case Officer Television Great Game. Today's content is more or less long story. To make a long story too short, that is, eradicate enemy or exterminate the enemy. In order to make America great again, we need to eradicate the enemy, exterminate the enemy. Today's topic is South Korea's National Intelligence Service has already been taken over by North Korea and the Chinese Communist Party, so it needs to be dismantled and re-established. Hello everybody. I'm writing and speaking to you on behalf of the Indo-Pacific Strategy Institute of the Republic of Korea. I would appreciate it if you could forward this letter and this broadcasting to President Donald J. Trump and his staff. I am a former case officer of the National Intelligence Service of the Republic of Korea. And I was a secret case officer who mainly dealt with North Korean and Chinese issues on the ground. I graduated from the Department of Chinese Language and Literature at Seoul National University and received a master's degree in Chinese simultaneous interpretation from the Graduate School of Interpretation and Translation at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, and mainly worked in China, the Americas, and Asia. I will tell President Donald J. Trump and his loyal aides how to resolve the current chaos in South Korea. If you put it into practice, you will be able to eliminate all the pro-China and pro-North Korea forces within South Korea. President Donald J. Trump should strongly demand that South Korea's prosecutor, police, and the National Intelligence Service immediately investigate and urgently arrest Moon Jae-in as the USB containing state secret that Moon Jae-in handed over to North Korea also contains data on United States forces in Korea. President Donald J. Trump should strongly demand that South Korea's the prosecutors, police, and National Intelligence Service immediately investigate and urgently arrest Moon Jae-in as the USB containing state secrets that Moon Jae-in handed over to North Korea also contains data on US forces in Korea. Since this fact was also reported by all media outlets in Korea, all citizens will agree to arrest Moon Jae-in on an emergency basis for espionage under Article 98 of the Criminal Act of the Republic of Korea. Article 98, spying of the Criminal Act of the Republic of Korea states that 1. Person who acts as a spy for an enemy country or assists a spy over an enemy country shall be punished by death, life imprisonment, or imprisonment for not less than 7 years. Number 2, a person who leaks military secret to an enemy country shall also be punished as per the preceding paragraph. Because it is written like this, Moon Jae-in's act of handing over a USB containing state secret to Kim Jong-un is a serious crime punishable by death for espionage. The prosecution, National Intelligence Service, police, military, judiciary, and the administrative agencies of the Yoon Suk-yeol government are all filled with Moon Jae-in's avatars. So, they have not investigated this case at all for the past 2 years. The USB that Moon Jae-in handed over to Kim Jong-un also contains data on U.S. forces in Korea. So, President Donald J. Trump should strongly demand that the Korean government arrest Moon Jae-in on charges of being a North Korean spy as soon as he takes office on January 20th. The USB that Moon Jae-in handed over to Kim Jong-un also contained data related to the United States forces in Korea. If such data falls into the hands of terrorist groups in China, Russia, Iran, and the Middle East, the U.S. forces in Korea could suffer a devastating blow at the hands of the Chinese military if they invade Taiwan. Therefore, the United States must request that the Korean government investigate this incident. Also, this USB contains all the data related to nuclear power plants in Korea and a large amount of data related to Korean weapons systems. If this data is transferred to China and Russia, the nuclear weapons and the various missiles of the Chinese and the Russian militaries will become more advanced and will be used to attack the United States. This USB also contains various source codes that can be used to hack Korean bank and cryptocurrency exchanges. North Korea and China can use this information to illegally steal huge amount of money from Korean financial institutions and extend their regime. It could open a loophole in President Donald J. Trump anti-China containment network, so it needs to be thoroughly investigated and blocked in advance. Since the fact that Moon Jae-in sent a large amount of money to North Korea has been made public by all Korean media outlets, we hope that the United States prosecutors and the FBI will indict Moon Jae-in in the judiciary for violating United States sanctions against North Korea and request the South Korean government to extradite him as a criminal and bring him to a United States court. South Korea's prosecution, police, and the National Intelligence Service, which are filled with Moon Jae-in's avatars, are unlikely to properly investigate Moon Jae-in's alleged violations of North Korea's sanctions. So, the United States investigative authorities must first investigate all those who violated North Korea's sanctions, including Moon Jae-in, in order to achieve results quickly. The prosecution has already completed 95% of its investigation into the personal corruption allegations against Moon Jae-in and his family. But the prosecution is not investigating any further and is just wasting time. President Trump needs to strongly demand that the Korean prosecution properly investigate Moon Jae-in's personal corruption and quickly arrest him. Once Moon Jae-in is arrested, it will be easy for the United States prosecutors to extradite him to the United States for violating United States sanctions against North Korea. The result of two appeals related to Lee Jae-myung's various corruption charges are expected to come out around February or March next year, and his legal arrest is certain. Also, the final Supreme Court ruling on Lee Hwa-young's remittance to North Korea is expected to come out around February or March next year. Therefore, Lee Jae-myung also needs to be indicted by the United States prosecutors and FBI for violating North Korea sanctions and strongly request the South Korean government to extradite him as a criminal and be brought to a United States court. Lee Jae-myung is under investigation by the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York on charges of sending money to North Korea using the cryptocurrency Ethereum created by Virgil Griffiths. So, after Lee Jae-myung is arrested by the Korean judicial authorities, please extradite him to the United States and conduct an investigation into the money transfer to North Korea. Please make Moon Jae-in a former leader of the Democratic Party of Korea and the former president, and the current leader of the Democratic Party of Korea stand trial in the United States on charge of sanctions against North Korea, and designate the Democratic Party of Korea as a terrorist organization linked to North Korea, and impose secondary boycott sanctions on the Democratic Party of Korea itself. In that case, we can legally provide the list of all members of the Democratic Party of Korea to Interpol and the United States government, and through international joint investigations, we can arrest all terrorists with ties to China and North Korea who are operating in Korea. The Democratic Party of Korea currently has about 40 billion won, about the $30 million, and they also have about the 40 billion won in cash too. If Moon Jae-in and Lee Jae-myung, both from the Democratic Party of Korea, are arrested for violating United States and the United Nations sanctions against North Korea, and stand trial in the United States, and the Democratic Party of Korea is designated as a terrorist organizations linked to North Korea. All assets held by the Democratic Party of Korea can be frozen. And it will be possible for the United States judicial authorities to recover the frozen assets of the Democratic Party of Korea and pay compensation to Otto Warmbier's family. And if the Democratic Party members turn into terrorists, the United States judicial authorities may seize various assets they have hidden in the United States. Kim Dae-jung is also known to have hidden astronomical amount of wealth in the United States, and those assets may also be seized. The assets seized in this way can be used to build U.S. Navy vessels, U.S. Navy ships. So far, I've told you how to designate the Democratic Party of Korea, a political party connected to North Korea and China, as a terrorist organization and dismantled it. Now, I'll tell you about the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, another criminal terrorist organizations connected to North Korea and China in South Korea. Please designate them as a terrorist organization connected to North Korea and the Chinese Communist Party, and designated all of their members as terrorists. The Korea Confederation of Trade Union has about 1 million members, and the annual membership fees they collect are over 100 billion won. If the organization is designated as a terrorist organization linked to North Korea, it will be possible to seize all cash assets of the Korea Confederation of Trade Union, and its members are provide them as a compensation to Otto Warmbier's family. Also, on April 15, 1969, a Navy reconnaissance aircraft EC-121 that took off from the U.S. Naval Air Station in Azuki, Japan, was shot down by North Korean missile. I'd like to ask that you provide compensation to the bereaved families of those who died on duty. And I would appreciate it if you could seize the assets of the Democratic Party of Korea and the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions and compensate the crew of the Pueblo and their families who were captured by the North Korean Navy in the East Sea on January 23, 1968. We also ask that you use this fund to compensate the American soldiers who were killed and injured in the axe murder incident by North Korean troops at Panmunjom at 10 a.m. on August 18, 1976. Also, I would appreciate it if you could seize the assets of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions and the Democratic Party of Korea and compensate the families of the American soldiers who died or injured or went missing during the Korean War. At that time, 1,789,000 American soldiers participated in the war, but now only about 300,000 of them are alive. I would be grateful if you could also seize the assets of the Korea Confederation of Trade Unions and the Democratic Party of Korea and compensate them for the Korean War veteran. If we designate the three organizations in South Korea, the Korean Confederation of Trade Union, the Democratic Party of Korea, and Progressive Party, as terrorist organizations with ties to North Korea and seize all of their assets. Approximately 80% of the pro-China and pro-North Korea forces in South Korea will disappear. It is very easy to clean up pro-China and pro-North Korea forces in Korea at once. It is enough to punish Moon Jae-in and Lee Jae-myung for violating U.S. and UN sanctions against North Korea, designate the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions and the Democratic Party of Korea, which are connected to them as international terrorist organizations linked to North Korea, and freeze all assets of these organizations and their members. President Donald J. Trump can solve this problem in 10 minutes. Let me tell you about the history of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, the largest terrorist group in South Korea linked to North Korea and the Chinese Communist Party, and what activities they have been doing in South Korea over the past 20 years. The first president of the Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea, founded in Shanghai, China on September 11, 1919, was Dr. Seungman Lee. Dr. Seungman Lee emphasized the theory of diplomatic independence to thoroughly persuade the United States in order to establish a liberal democratic nation based on American-style presidential system and Christianity. On the other hand, independence activists who received funding from Russia's Lenin, such as Park Geun-hye and Lee Dong-hui, emphasized armed struggle against Japan in order to build a communist society. As a result, Dr. Seungman Lee, the first president of Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea, was impeached by communists who had received funding from Russia in 1925. The Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea initially chose the American-style presidential system due to the influence of President Seungman Lee, who had earned a doctorate in international politics from Princeton University in the United States, and the Provisional Charter and the Constitution incorporated the John Locke's theory of the government and the spirit of the American Constitution. The Provisional Charter and the Provisional Constitution of the Republic of Korea explicitly stated that personal freedom, such as freedom of religion, was essential, that all citizens were equal before the law, and that no one could be punished except in accordance with the law, and that all punishment that injured human life should be abolished. Moreover, according to the Provisional Charter of the Republic of Korea, this country was founded according to the will of God, and therefore must join the League of Nations in order to contribute to the peace of mankind. Dr. Seungman Lee studied at the Beje School established by the American missionary Appenzeller, where he learned English and American educations and studied the Bible. He was imprisoned for 5 years and 7 months for insisting on the introduction of a constitutional monarchy to limit the king's power, and he studied the Bible diligently during that time. He visited the United States as a special envoy of the Joseon dynasty. But when he was unable to achieve his purpose of visit, he studied at George Washington University in the United States, Washington, D.C., and received a master's degree from Harvard University and a doctorate in international politics from Princeton University. While receiving his doctorate from the Princeton University, he also studied theology at Princeton University. He traveled throughout the United States, giving speeches urging the United States to grant independence from Japan and to establish a new nation on the Korea Peninsula based on the American presidential system and Christianity. Accordingly, provisional government of the Republic of Korea, that designed by Dr. Seungman Lee, was run thoroughly in accordance with the American presidential system and the spirit of the American Constitution, and the provisional charter and the provisional constitution included individual freedom and the freedom of religion, which were product of the European Reformation. Furthermore, Dr. Seungman Lee, who studied under American missionary, designed the Republic of Korea to be a thoroughly Christian nation. For over 2,000 years, Korean ancestors had tried to establish and run Buddhist and Confucian states, but they had failed. Therefore, in order to rebuild the fallen country, Dr. Seungman Lee believed that the country should be established based on American-style Christianity, which was the world's most powerful country, so that corruption could disappear, the country could grow into a powerful nation, and contribute to world peace. However, the people of the provisional government of the Republic of Korea, who had fought against Japan for the expansion of communism with Lenin's funds, received an order from Lenin to eliminate President Seungman Lee, who was based on the American-style presidential system and Christianity, and to wipe out the national culture. Therefore, in 1925, they impeached President Seungman Lee as the president of the provisional government of the Republic of Korea and changed the political system to a Soviet-style cabinet responsibility system. And Kim Gu became chairman on December 14, 1926. The title chairman is a little used to refer to the top leader in communist countries, such as Chairman Xi Jinping and Chairman Kim Il-sung. In March 1923, President Seungman Lee published an article in Pacific magazine explaining why communism was bad. The roots of the current Korean left and the Democratic Party of Korea be traced back to communists who received funds from Lenin and worked in the provisional government. Therefore, they commemorate the chairman Kim Gu, who established the first communist provisional government in Korean history. Lenin, who took power after overthrowing the Russian Romanov dynasty through the Russian Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, provided an astronomical amount of political funds to Korean independence activists and urged them to work to spread communism. He also ordered them to destroy national culture and religion in order to spread communism. Accordingly, the Korean communists ruled about 3,500 armed soldiers who were engaging in an armed struggle against Japan for national liberation to the city of Svobodny, Russia, and shoot them all dead at the Svobodny train station on June 28, 1921, and arrested all survivors and sent them to Siberian concentration camp. After this incident, the armed struggle against Japan was completely extinguished, and the Korean communists who received orders from Russia fought against Japan for Russia. But after Japan's defeat on August 15, 1945, they entered the Korean peninsula and boasted that they were independence activists who had fought against Japan. Therefore, Koreans at that time who had no idea what communism was thought that communists were true independence activists who fought against Japan and achieved independence. Also, many people voluntarily became communists in order to inherit the spirit of independence activists, believing that they were good people. This phenomenon is still being repeated in Korea in 2024. The grandfather of Lee Jong-chan, who served as the first director of the National Intelligence Service under the Kim Dae-jung administration, is known as the independence activist Lee Hwae-young. Lee Hwae-young organized the Korean Anarchist Communist League in Shanghai, China in February 1928 and engaged in extreme communist activities. Lee Hwae-young is a person who created a magazine called Talhwan, which advocated direct propaganda and violent direct actions to build an anarchist communist society that abolishes all political activities, the state, the centralized organizations, private property systems, religions, marriage system, and the family system, and that an anarchist communist society must be built after reclaiming the Korea Peninsula from the capitalist country of Japan. However, because Lee Hwae-young was portrayed as an independence activist, Lee Jong-chan, Lee Hwae-young's grandson, was able to enter the Korea Military Academy and become the director of the National Intelligence Service and a member of the National Assembly. If it had been known that Lee Hwae-young was a communist, Lee Jong-chan would not have been able to enter the Korea Military Academy. However, while serving as the director of the National Intelligence Service under the Kim Dae-jung administration, Lee Jong-chan handed over to North Korea a list of secret agents that South Korea intelligence agencies had secretly planted in North Korea, resulting in their execution. He also brutally purged the hundreds of intelligence agents within South Korea's prosecutors, police, National Intelligence Service, and the military. After that, the prosecution, police, National Intelligence Service, and the military were filled with Kim Dae-jung followers and communists. President Yoon Suk-yeol and Han Dong-hoon also said that they respected Kim Dae-jung, and even though they knew that Moon Jae-in handed over a USB containing state secrets to Kim Jong-un, they did not investigate at all. Lee Jong-chan is still active as a descendant of independence activists and created a foundation to honor his grandfather Lee Hwae-young, who was a communist. But all records of Lee Hwae-young's communist armed riot activities have been deleted from the foundation's homepage. Currently, there are too many Korean independence activists who engaged in communist activities like Lee Hwae-young, and although they are packaged as descendants of independence activists like Lee Jong-chan, is in reality too many people with communist ideologies are in high government positions. Even in 2024, when many records exist, there are many cases where communists are mistaken for independence activists. Most of the communists who entered the Korean Peninsula after Japan's defeat on August 15, 1945, were portrayed as independence activists who fought against Japan. According to a survey conducted by the United States military in 1946, 76% of all Koreans thought that socialism and communism were good things. Most of the independence activists who fought against Japan received orders and funds from Russia and fought against Japan for Russia or to expand communism. Because their descendants still remain in many parts of South Korea, the specter of communism still runs rampant in Korea. Some of the people from Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea who had received funds from Lenin and engaged in communist activities entered the Korean Peninsula after Japan's defeat on August 15, 1945. Some entered North Korea and founded the Democratic People's Republic of Korea with Kim Sung-ju, who had been nominated by the Soviet Union, and some entered South Korea and created several communist parties. After merging into the South Korean Workers' Parties on November 23, 1946, they elected Park Hun-young as the party's representatives. They knew that Dr. Seungman Lee, who had returned from the United States, would establish a Christian nation in South Korea based on an American-style presidential system and liberal democracy, and they continuously carried out various terrorist attacks and operations under the orders of the Soviet Union to obstruct the establishment of the Republic of Korea. However, in the end, on August 15, 1948, the current Republic of Korea was founded by Dr. Seungman Lee based on the American-style presidential system, liberal democracy, free market economy, and Christianity, and Dr. Seungman Lee became the first president. The Constitution of the Republic of Korea was created based on the Provisional Constitution that had already been created by the Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea, and it continues to be the current Republic of Korea. Communist Park Geun-hyeon, who had been attempting to prevent the birth of an American-style liberal democracy in South Korea under Soviet orders, secretly issued counterfeit currency in May 1946 to raise funds for his activities. When he was in danger of being arrested by American troops, he announced new tactics and committed acts of terrorism, including carrying out various terrorist attacks and assassinating key figures. Also, under the leadership of the Communist Party of Korea, a strike by railway workers in Busan area began to September 23, 1946, and from September 24th, under the leadership of the National Council of Korean Trade unions from each industry across the country joined together to launch a general strike. The Workers' Party of Korea, under Soviet orders, mobilized all communists in South Korea to start a riot in Daegu on October 1st, 1946, and the riot spread nationwide, killing, disappearing, and injuring thousands of people. Members of the Communist Party of Korea committed unspeakable atrocities, such as burning police officers and their families to death, tearing out their skin, gouging out their eyeballs, and mutilating their corpses. They also looted the police stations, the armory, spread all sorts of false rumors, and in order to incite a riot, they stole the corpses of people who had died of cholera from the hospital in Daegu, placed them in the middle of the road, and incited people to beat the police to death, calling them corpses killed by police. The Daegu October Communist riots, which was caused by communists under the direction of the Soviet Union, had the same pattern as the riot that took place in Gwangju, Jeollanam-do, Jeolla Southern Province on May 18, 1980s. After the Daegu October Communist uprising under the direction of the Soviet Union, on November 23, 1946, the three parties, the Korean Communist Party, the South Korean New Democratic Party, and the Korean People's Party, merged in Seoul, South Korea, to create the Communist Party, the South Korean Workers' Party, and elected Park Geun-hyeon as the party leader. Park Geun-hyeon worked in the provisional government of the Republic of Korea, but after receiving funds from Lenin, he joined hands with the Russian Bolshevik Revolutionary Forces with the provisional government of the Republic of Korea to expand communism and fought against Japan for Russia. However, at the time, he was portrayed as an independence activist who fought against Japan, so he was able to gather many supporters. at 2 o'clock a.m. on April 3rd, 1948. At the same time as a signal fire was lit on 샛별 오름, a low hill in Jeju Island. Members of the Jeju branches of the South Korea Workers' Party rioted throughout the Jeju Island, attacked police stations, killed police officers, stole police uniforms, disguised themselves as police officers, and killed people. And there were many members of the South Korean Workers' Party in the military unit that was trying to suppress the communist uprising, and they killed the commander and started a rebellion. They brutally killed Jeju residents and raped women all over Jeju Island. They brutally killed people, mutilated their bodies, and committed the atrocities such as burying pastors alive. The reason why communists in Jeju Island who received orders from Kim Song-ju, the fake Kim Il-sung, rioted throughout the Jeju Island was to disrupt the National Assembly election approved by the UN on May 10, 1948. They killed election officials and the police officers, massacred their families, and mutilated their bodies. Kim Dal-sam, the commander who led the riot at the time, stole about the 50,000 ballots and went to North Korea, where he became a member of the National Assembly. Riots occurred intermittently on Jeju Island from March 1st, 1947, but they exploded on April 3rd, 1948, and were finally suppressed throughout Jeju Island on September 21st, 1954. When the 14th Regiment of the Korean National Defense Guard stationed in Yeosu was to be dispatched to suppress the Jeju April 3rd communist riot, members of the South Korean Workers' Party belonging to the 14th Regiment of the ROK Army revolted on October 19, 1948, and the riot again in the Yeosu and Suncheon areas. At this time as well, many residents were massacred by the rebels. Even after Japan's defeat on August 15, 1945, South and North Korea continued to use currency issued by the Bank of Joseon. On December 6, 1947, fake Kim Il-sung and Kim Song-ju secretly reformed the currency in North Korea and smuggled the discarded currency from North Korea to South Korea. They then created several media outlets in South Korea and bribed politicians. The person in charge of this work was Sung Si-baek, a member of Chinese Communist Party who acted as an independence activist in South Korea under the order of Kim Il-sung. Until the ban on inter-Korean trade in February 1948, Sung Si-baek smuggled in pork and other goods on 56 occasions, creating over 100 million won in political funds at the time. By March 1950s, Sung Si-baek had secured $39,000 US in operational funds through smuggling with China. He also smuggled currency issued by the Bank of Joseon, which had been scrapped in North Korea, into South Korea, and distributed a huge amount of political funds. Under Kim Il-sung's instructions, spy espionage Sung Si-bae created the several media outlets, including the Joseon and Central Ilbo and the Uri newspaper, and created a number of civic groups of manipulate the public opinions in South Korea. He also bribed a large number of politicians to make them agree with North Korea's claim. In 1948, North Korea carried out various sabotage operations to disrupt the UN-approved National Assembly election on May 10th, and in the National Assembly elections on May 30th, 1950. North Korea actively supported the candidates of the Communist Party members in accordance with the Kim Il-sung's directive to launch a pro-launch offensive, both legal and illegal. In addition, it provided the massive amount of political funds to politicians with pro-North Korean tendencies. The spy Sung Si-bae intervened in elections in South Korea by recruiting a large number of the high-ranking politicians at the time and providing massive political funds. He was arrested by investigative authorities on May 15, 1950, 50 days before the general election. A total of 112 people were arrested. Since 1948, North Korea has always intervened in South Korea's National Assembly elections. And even now, politicians from the Democratic Party of Korea and the Progressive Party, who are receiving orders from North Korea, are legally entering the National Assembly and passing on various confidential information to North Korea and China. The current Democratic Party of Korea is a party that succeeded the South Korean Labor Party established by Park Geun-hye, and Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyun, Moon Jae-in, and Lee Jae-myung have inherited Park Geun-hye's spirit and have tried to cleverly dismantle the Republic of Korea and hand it over to North Korea. Recently, when North Korea has been virtually neutralized, they are trying to hand the Republic of Korea over to China. President Yoon Suk-yeol and former Justice Minister Han Dong-hoon have said that they will carry on the spirit of Kim Dae-jung, but the meaning of the phrase spirit of Kim Dae-jung is to dismantle the Republic of Korea and build a communist society. Yoon Suk-yeol and Han Dong-hoon investigated about the 1,000 police, National Intelligence Service, and military intelligence agents on various charges during their time as prosecutors, arrested about the 200 of them, and are the ones responsible for dismantling all of South Korea's security agencies. After that, Moon Jae-in appointed the communists to all of those positions. On August 15, 2016, when the People Daily, the official newspaper of the Chinese Communist Party, issued an order to impeach President Park Geun-hye for allowing the deployment of THAAD, prosecutors Yoon Suk-yeol and Han Dong-hoon framed President Park Geun-hye and arrested her, and also arrested a large number of Supreme Court justices enabling them to appoint Moon Jae-in's avatars to the judiciary. In addition, prosecutor Yoon Suk-yeol and Han Dong-hun arrested Samsung chairman Lee Jae-yong and dragged him to court on various charges for the past 9 years, preventing Samsung from making proper investments and causing Samsung's stock price to plummet. If Samsung goes bankrupt, they will be able to legally hand over Samsung's advanced semiconductor technologies, electronic technologies, and overseas market to Chinese companies. The Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, disguised as a labor union, has been carrying out large-scale anti-government struggles nationwide every September and October since September 24, 1946, when labor unions across each industry across the country went on a general strike under the leadership of the National Council of Korean Labor Unions and to commemorate the Daegu October Communist Riot. The Korean Confederation of Trade Unions originated from the National Council of Korean Trade Unions, which operated under the orders of the Soviet Union and the Workers' Party of Korea, and is currently carrying out anti-state terrorist activities such as anti-American rallies, anti-Japanese rallies, pro-Chinese rallies, pro-North Korean rallies, and anti-government rallies, as well as violent terrorist attacks nationwide. In the past time, the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions received orders from North Korea, but recently it has been receiving orders from North Korea and the Chinese Communist Party. In order for the U.S. intelligence authorities to properly understand the nature of the Democratic Party of Korea and the Korea Confederation of Trade Unions, they should closely analyze the activities of the Communist Party of Korea, the South Korean Workers' Party, and the National Council of Korean Trade Unions. In addition, if they want to know the true nature of Moon Jae-in and Lee Jae-myung, they should closely analyze Park Kwon-young. The political party that the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions created is the Democratic Party of Korea, and the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions has about 1 million members, and most of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions members are either members of the Democratic Party of Korea or supporters. The Korean Confederation of Trade Union also includes the Civil Servants Labor Union and the Public Institution Labor Union, and it is known that many of the Central Election Commission employees who manage all elections in Korea are also members of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions. The Korean Confederation of Trade Unions is deeply connected to North Korea and the Chinese Communist Party. Currently, many of the Central Election Commission's employees have Chinese names instead of Korean names. And when the public demanded an investigations into the truth, the Central Election Commission recently attempted to create a law that would punish those who track and announce election fraud, but gave up after encountering resistance from the public. reporters from major Korean broadcasting stations such as MBC, KBS, SBS, YTN, Yonhap News, and various newspapers are members of the Citizens Coalition for Democratic Media, and organizations under the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions. Therefore, the tones of most Korean media outlets is determined by the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, which receives orders from North Korea and the Chinese Communist Party. So, they are spreading malicious report about the President Donald J. Trump and trying to divide the Republic of Korea and United States alliance. Therefore, President Donald J. Trump should designate the Korean Confederation of Trade Union as a terrorist organization linked to North Korea and seize Korean Confederation of Trade Unions related bank account to seize their funds. Also, President Donald J. Trump, please investigate the rumor that NBC took satellite broadcasting vehicles designated as a strategic material because it could be used as a mobile missile control tower to Pyongyang, North Korea, while broadcasting the cultural performance is commemorating the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympic Games, and then left it in Pyongyang. If this rumor is confirmed to be true, please shut down NBC for violating sanctions against North Korea. Also, please designate NBC as a terrorist organization linked to North Korea. It is known that the U.S. intelligence agency has already investigated and obtained a lot of intelligence. So, if you look into it, you will know the result right away. The declaration posted on the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions website is as follows. Since it contains many terms from the North Korean Socialist Constitution, it is difficult to view it as a normal labor union. Rather, it is a terrorist group receiving orders from North Korea. Therefore, please designate the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions as a terrorist group linked to North Korea and punish all of its executives as terrorists. Declaration of Korean Confederation of Trade Unions. As the main force of production and the subject of social reform and historical development, we inherit the achievement of the indomitable struggle of our senior workers over the past 100 years and the democratic labor movement that has become a huge trend since the Great Labor Struggle of 1987 and formed the Korean Confederation of Trade Union, the National Central Organization of Independent and Democratic Labor Unions. We declare that we will hold high the flag of the Korean Confederation of Trade Union, and under the principles of independence, democracy, unifications, and solidarity, we will unite firmly with one comradeship and fight vigorously until the day of construction of a unified fatherland and a democratic society that guarantees human dignity and equality by improving the political, economic, and social status of workers and the quality of life of all citizens. the phrase "we are the indomitable struggle of senior workers for over 100 years" that appears in the Declaration of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions refers to the 1917 Russian Bolshevik Communist Revolution. Also, the words independence, democracy, unification, and solidarity that appear in the Declaration of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions are terms that appeared in the North Korean Socialist Constitution. Also, the word unified fatherland that appears in the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions Declaration is a term that appears in the North Korean Socialist Constitution, and it means that North Korea will absorb South Korea and unify it into a communist society. This word is definitely not a word that can appear in a labor union declaration. This word, unified fatherland, is a word that Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un shout out every day. Article 7 of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions platform states, "We will strengthen the international labor movement in solidarity with workers around the world, promote the human rights, and realize the permanent world peace against the threats of war and nuclear weapons." This means solidarity with socialist and communist organizations around the world that began with the Bolshevik Communist Revolution in Russia in 1917, and that we will spread socialism and communism throughout the world. If you look at the 7th paragraph of this platform, it says, "We will achieve a permanent world peace against the threat of the war and the nuclear weapons, which has nothing to do with the labor unions." This sentence is about achieving permanent world peace against the threat of American nuclear weapons, and it is a slogan that Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il have always shouted. The Korean Confederation of Trade Union is not a normal labor union in South Korea, but an international terrorist organization that specialized in anti-American, anti-Japanese, pro-Chinese, and pro-North Korean demonstrations under orders from North Korea. On June 13, 2002, when 2 middle school girls were killed after being hit by a tank driven by the U.S. military in Yangju County, Gyeonggi Province, members of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions incited nationwide anti-American rallies by claiming that a simple traffic accident had been intentionally caused by the U.S. military running the girls over with their tank and killing them. As a result, Roh Moo-hyun, who the people knew nothing about, was elected president. Many suspect that during the 2000 Inter-Korean Summit, Kim Jong-il and Kim Dae-jung rode in the same car, and that during this process, Kim Jong-il asked Kim Dae-jung elect Roh Moo-hyun as the next president. Electronics voting machines were suddenly introduced starting in the 2002 presidential election, but Korean-made electronic voting machines are being used for election fraud around the world, creating bad examples of election results being overturned. The South Korean media outlet Sky Daily, in its December 12, 2024 article titled Exclusive Kim Dae-jung and Lee Hae-chan ordered the production of fraudulent vote counting machines, provides a good explanation of how the fraudulent election cartel was formed from the Kim Dae-jung administration to the Roh Moo-hyun administrations. The Korean Confederation of Trade Unions also has a member organization called the National Public Service Workers Union, and I understand that a significant number of the Central Election Management Committee employees are included in these organizations. Also, in 2008, members of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions deceived the entire nations by claiming that eating American beef would cause mad cow disease and cause holes in the brain, and then started a riot in an attempt to overthrow the Lee Myung-bak government. In addition, members of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions spread fake news that if THAAD is deployed in Seongju County, Gyeongsang-buk-do, the electromagnetic waves from the THAAD will fry the melons, a specialty of Seongju County, and caused riots nationwide while opposing the deployment of THAAD in order to overthrow the Park Geun-hye government. Moon Jae-in, who ran the government jointly with the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, which receives orders from North Korea and China, provided information to civic groups in order to block the deployment of THAAD and mobilize civic groups to block the introduction of the THAAD radar system for several years, and as a result, U.S. soldiers stationed in Korea inside the THAAD base were not able to eat or shower properly for several years. If you look at the civic groups leading anti-American protests, most of the members are members of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions. So, you can think of the Korean Confederation of the Trade Unions as having created and operating thousands of civic groups in order to carry out orders from North Korea and China. The Board of Audit and Inspection has discovered that the Moon Jae-in government Blue House officials handed over sensitive level 2nd military secrets related to the THAAD deployment, such as the THAAD missile replacement operation name, operation date, and operation details to a defense attaché at the Chinese embassy in Korea. As a result, the prosecution is currently investigating a total of 8 people, including National Security Office Director Jung Eui-yong, First Deputy Director of the National Security Office Seo Ju-seok, Minister of National Defense Jung Kyung-do, and Lee Ki-hyun, current member of National Assembly from the Democratic Party of Korea, and the Blue House secretaries. The Korean Confederation of Trade Unions staged violent protests to block the construction of the Pyeongtaek U.S. military base and also staged violent protests to block the construction of the Jeju naval base. During the Lee Myung-bak administrations, there were terrorist act, such as illegally occupying the Hanjin heavy industries in Yeongjong-do, Busan, for a long period of time and turning the area into a liberated zone in order to block the construction of a Jeju naval base and to obstruct the construction of a landing ship by the South Korean Navy that would threaten North Korea. Hanjin Heavy Industries is a shipyard that mainly builds large landing ships and various speedboats for the South Korean Navy, and is a shipyard that builds warships that threaten North Korea. If this shipyard had been occupied and blueprints of the South Korean naval vessels stored there had been leaked to North Korea, the South Korean Navy could have been in serious danger. About 3 kilometers away from the Hanjin Heavy Industries shipyard in Yeongjong-do, Busan, there was a domestic and international passenger ship dock bound for Jeju Island and Japan. Members of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions took control of Hanjin Heavy Industries, built a base, and then took a passenger ship to Jeju Island to disrupt the construction of the Jeju Naval Base, where they staged various illegal and violent protests. They are not labor union, but a terrorist group that faithfully carries out orders from North Korea and the Chinese Communist Party. Therefore, President Donald J. Trump should designate the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions and all of its subordinate organizations as international terrorist group linked to North Korea and the Chinese Communist Party. And Korean Federation of Trade Unions is a terrorist group that has been staging illegal, violent protests, including pro-North Korea protests, anti-American protests, and anti-Japanese protests since the Kim Yong-sam administrations, including various violent protests nationwide to oppose the Korea and U.S. FTA. And they are a terrorist group that engaged in various illegal acts of violence, such as interfering in various vested interests at construction site, wielding violence, and assaulting union members who are not members of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions. On February 13, 2018, the GM automobile plant in Gunsan, Jeollabuk-do, was closed down, and members of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions committed acts of terrorism, including illegally protesting and destroying various furniture in the president's office. Those who are protecting and preventing the punishment of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, a terrorist organization under the command of North Korea and the Chinese Communist Party, are Moon Jae-in, Lee Jae-myung, and politicians from the Democratic Party of Korea. If you look at the bulletin board of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions website, you can find numerous articles praising Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il and directives from the North Korea. And recently, many Korean Confederation of Trade Unions executives have been arrested on charges of being North Korean spies. The Korean Confederation of Trade Unions collects membership fees from union members across the country. which amounts to about 100 million annually. No, 100 million US dollars annually. With this money, it supports university student groups that protest against the United States, Japan, North Korea, and China, and supporters homosexuals to participate in various illegal and violent rallies. Among the organizations under the Korean Confederation of Trade Union, there is an organization called the National Metal Workers Union. This organization is a specialized protest unit that appears in all anti-American, anti-Japanese, pro-Chinese, and pro-North Korean demonstrations in South Korea. This organization is disguised as a labor union, but if you look at the platform posted on the organization's homepage, you will see the following sentence. International solidarity. We stand in solidarity with workers around the world, opposing subordination and the inequality between countries and wars of any kind, and fighting to overthrow the neoliberalism. This sentence means solidarity within the International Communist Organization that originated from the Russian Bolshevik Communist Revolution of 1917. Also, if you look at the platform posted on the group's homepage, you will find the following sentences. Unification. We will promptly withdraw the United States military that has occupied our land and fight to build a unified country based on the principles of the independence, peace, and national unity. This sentence is a direct quote from Article 9 of the North Korean Socialist Constitution, which reads as follows. Article 9. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea shall strengthen the people's power in the northern half, vigorously carry out the three great revolutions of ideologies, technology, and culture, achieve the complete victory of socialism, and struggle to realize the reunification of the country on the principles of the independence, peaceful reunification, and the great national unity. No one knows why the withdrawal of the U.S. troops from Korea is included in the nation's platform, and the slogans that Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un have already shouted are included in the platform. If you look at the wording of the declaration posted on the homepage of the Korean Metal Workers Union, it contains the word unified the fatherland, which means that North Korea will occupy South Korea, abolish liberal democracy, and realize a communist society in South Korea. The contents of the declaration are as follows. We, metal workers, will fight in solidarity with workers around the world against the globalization of neoliberal capital that is causing subordinations, discriminations, and the spread of the poverty in order to protect human dignity and an equal life. And we will take the lead in building a society where workers and the people are the masters, an equal society where oppressions and discrimination are eliminated, and a unified fatherland where the South and the North are one, in solidarity with the people and the progressive forces of this land. Moon Jae-in ran the government in cooperation with the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions and the party that the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions observed and runs is the Democratic Party of Korea, which is currently led by Lee Jae-myung. The main force of the Moon Jae-in government was the members of the National University Student Representative Council, who led pro-North Korea demonstrations across the country in the 1970s and the 1980s. Members of the National Council of University Student Representative, which was the core force of the Moon Jae-in administration, ordered various violent terrorist attacks against members of the Korean University Student Association, who led pro-North Korea protests nationwide in the 1990s, and sent them to prison. After that, they monopolized both central and local political power and took over massive vested interest in business and amassed power and wealth. But they gave nothing to members of the Korean University Student Association who were 10 years their juniors. Accordingly, the members of the Korean University Student Council Union gathered all the members of the Unified Progressive Party, which was dissolved in Korea as an unconstitutional political party, and joined hands with Lee Jae-myung, the mayor of Seongnam City, to intervene in various vested interests in Seongnam City and illegally raise a huge amount of political funds. Member of the Korean University Student Council Association successfully mobilized a huge amount of money illegally raised to bribe Democratic Party members, take control of the party, and make Lee Jae-myung the leader of the Democratic Party of Korea and run him as the presidential candidate in the last presidential election. Lee Jae-myung, who took control of the Democratic Party of Korea, and members of the Korean University Student Council Union, mobilized massive funds to appoint their avatars to the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, which Moon Jae-in had been controlling, and to control of the Korean Confederation of Unions again. Lee Jae-myung and the members of the Korean University Student Council Union were sharpening their sword of revenge against Moon Jae-in and the members of the National Council of University Student Representatives who ignored them, used them thoroughly, and then abandoned them. Accordingly, if Lee Jae-myung becomes the president of Korea, not only will Korea's liberal democratic system be completely destroyed, but also there are rumors that Moon Jae-in and the members of the National University Student Representative Council who participated in anti-American protests on universities across the country in the 1970s and the 1980s will also be sent to prison one by one. So, in order to prevent Lee Jae-myung from becoming the next president, Moon Jae-in, who was terrified, instructed his former bodyguard, Yoon Suk-yeol, to pretend to challenge Moon Jae-in, and after resigning from the position of Prosecutor General, Yoon Suk-yeol joined the People Power Party and entered the primary for the party's presidential candidates. Many conservative citizens supported Yoon Suk-yeol, who was the prosecutor general, believing that he would get rid of Moon Jae-in and all pro-North Korean forces in the Democratic Party of Korea because he was not on good terms with Moon Jae-in. However, when his supporter base was lacking, Moon Jae-in caused many members of his fan club, the Citizens Coalition for Awakening, to leave the Democratic Party and join the People Power Party to support Yoon Suk-yeol. Nevertheless, when Hong Jun-pyo came in first and Yoon Suk-yeol came in second in the opinion polls, Yoon Suk-yeol instructed election broker Myung Tae-gyun to manipulate the opinion polls and rose to first place based on the manipulated opinion poll support ratings. Election broker Myung Tae-gyun was arrested by the prosecution by chance. And while searching his cell phone, all conversations between President Yoon Suk-yeol and his wife Kim Gun-hee and Myung Tae-gyun were discovered, leading the prosecution to launch an investigation into President Yoon Suk-yeol's manipulation of public opinion. The prosecution confiscated the 3 mobile phones and 1 USB from election broker Myung Tae-gyun and is currently analyzing them with the result expected to be out in January next year. In addition, it was revealed that Yoon Suk-yeol's wife Kim Gun-hee gave money to election broker Myung Tae-gyun and was involved in the selection of National Assembly candidates, so the prosecution's investigation is also underway. The prosecution began investigating the incident in October of the last year, in which a significant number of People Power Party politicians paid money to Myung Tae-gyun to manipulate public opinion to bring down the number one candidate and rise to the top spot. And Lee Jae-myung pressured the prosecution to investigate by taking advantage of President Yoon Suk-yeol's weaknesses. Lee Jae-myung was expected to be arrested on various charges in January or February next year, and President Yoon Suk-yeol approval rating would also fall below 10% by January next year, making it impossible for him to continue performing his duties as president. And President Yoon Suk-yeol's wife Kim Gun-hee was in danger of being arrested on charges of violating the election law and the political funding law. If President Yoon Suk-yeol's wife Kim Gun-hee were arrested, President Yoon Suk-yeol would also be impeached. Next, arrest was inevitable due to various corruption charges such as a failure of medical policy and election interference. Then a terrified President Yoon Suk-yeol suddenly declared the martial law on the evening of December 3rd, leading to the current situation. In order for United States intelligence agencies to understand the current spread of the communism in Korea, they need to know more about how the 1917 Russian Bolshevik Revolution and the Korean independence activists were connected and what their descendants are currently doing now. In addition, we must analyze the activities of the South Korean Labor Party, Park Kun-young, and the National Council of Korean Trade Unions that caused the Daegu Communist riot in October 1946. The model of the Daegu October Communist riot in 1946 that had caused became the model for the riot that occurred in Gwangju from May 18, 1980. These two riots have the same patterns. On May 18, 1980, the Gwangju riots began, and on June 21st, the Navy engaged and sank a spy ship heading to North Korea off the coast of Sosan, South Chungcheong province. At that time, North Korea dispatched 12 MiG fighters to protect the spy ship and dispatched the 5 North Korean warships that crossed the northern limit line and headed south. The cause of all this fraudulent election and various anti-American demonstrations in South Korea lies with North Korea and China. The People Power Party already went to Beijing in 2009 and signed the business exchanges agreement with the Chinese Communist Party and the Democratic Party of the Korea Democratic Research Institute went to Beijing in 2019 and signed the business exchange agreement with the Chinese Communist Party Party School. Therefore, all political parties in South Korea are currently comprised of lackeys of North Korea and China. Moon Jae-in used a huge amount of political funds to make Yoon Suk-yeol and Han Dong-hoon his former bodyguard, the president of the People Power Party and the party's leader. Yoon Suk-yeol and Han Dong-hoon said they would inherit the spirit of Kim Dae-jung and that they would include the spirit of the May 18, 1980 Gwangju riots, suspected of being caused by North Korea in the preamble of the Constitution. President Yoon Suk-yeol has completely destroyed the South Korean military in 2.5 years, causing some 20,000 Korean soldiers to leave the military. He has also intentionally destroyed South Korea's best medical systems. He has also cut funding for scientific research and development by 30%, preventing all kinds of cutting-edge research. All of these actions were carried out ahead of the April 2024 general elections, and they intentionally lost their elections. And for the past 2.5 years, they have blocked investigation into Moon Jae-in, who passed military secrets to Kim Jong-un. Han Dong-hoon also did not investigate Lee Jae-myung, Ethereum cryptocurrency remittance to North Korea, and did not investigate Moon Jae-in espionage charges. Therefore, in order for President Donald J. Trump to destroy the Chinese Communist Party, he needs to preemptively designate the Democratic Party of Korea and Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, which are subordinate organizations of the China and North Korea, and the terrorist organizations, as terrorist organizations linked to North Korea, and freeze all their assets. And President Donald J. Trump needs to pressure the Korean government to designate all members of the Democratic Party of Korea and the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions as members of the terrorist organizations and hand over the list to Interpol thereby fundamentally blocking their international activities and confiscating all their assets hidden overseas. After designating the Democratic Party of Korea as a terrorist organization linked to North Korea and disbanding it, we need to induce President Trump to create a new political party by nominating someone he can trust. And the National Intelligence Service of the Republic of Korea needs to be disbanded and a new intelligence agency created because all of its agents were planted by Kim Dae-jung. When creating a new intelligence agency, it is necessary to appoint a person who is well versed in the history of communists dating back to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, well versed in local conditions in China, and closely connected to the Trump administration in the United States as the head of the newly created intelligence agency in Korea. If you don't understand the activities of international communist forces over the past 100 years, there will be no use in creating a new intelligence agency. There should be also a massive effort to root out communists hiding in the police, prosecutors' offices, the judiciary, and the civil service organization. It seems very complicated, but if we just dismantle the Democratic Party of Korea, the Korean Confederation of Trade Union, and MBC Broadcasting, which left its broadcasting vehicles in Pyongyang in 2018, by imposing secondary boycott sanctions, 80% of the problem will be solved. Thank you for listening. This is Suyong Choi, Indo-Pacific Strategy Institute. Thank you very much. God bless your country, and God bless your people. To make America great again, we have to eradicate enemies. We eliminate enemies. Thank you.